Hello and welcome to the GeoCurrents lecture series on global demography. Today's lecture is the concluding lecture in the series. Rather than give an overview of the course as a whole, I am instead going to focus on countries that have very high rates of fertility and a few countries that have very low rates of fertility and look at some of the issues they face. Two countries will have special attention here: Nigeria in Africa and Chile in South America. As I've mentioned several times in this class, there's a relatively close but imperfect correlation between human development, and by that I refer to, I look at the Human Development Index as developed by the United Nations, which looks at health, longevity, education, and economic growth, gross domestic product, if you will. And we can see, anyway, by comparing these two maps, that there's a pretty close connection. It's not perfect by any means, but total fertility rates are highest in tropical Africa. And as you can see on the map below, Human Development Index tends to be lowest in tropical Africa. So there are some exceptions here. For example, Kazakhstan in Central Asia has a relatively high, medium-high Human Development Index, but also has a somewhat elevated fertility rate, not super high, but definitely above replacement level. And I've noted before that Central Asia has a unique feature of having higher than expected fertility levels, considering its general levels of social and economic development. Because we do have these high rates of fertility in tropical Africa, it's widely expected that the global population is going to become much more African in its constitution in the future. So we have here a graph from the World Population Prospects from the United Nations. It's a bit out of date, 2019, but you could see Africa is projected to have an increasing share of the global population. The population of Asia is projected to decline starting around 2050, whereas Africa is going to continue to increase. We always have to take these sorts of projections with a healthy degree of skepticism. As I've noted several times, demographers have not been particularly good at projecting future populations, but they're the best we have. And also, if we were to update this to 2025, if anything, the share of population that would be constituted by Africa would increase, in that Asian fertility rates have dropped faster than anticipated. Those of Africa are starting to drop now, but it's been much delayed. If we just take sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa south of the Sahara, and look at the Human Development Index and the total fertility rate, we can see more clearly how these two are correlated. I've labeled several countries that are relatively high for Africa on the Human Development Index: South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Gabon, Ghana, and Kenya. And if you look at the map on the right, all of them have fertility rates lower than sub-Saharan Africa in general. This relationship doesn't hold for all countries. DR Congo, right in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa, has a very high fertility rate, and its Human Development Index is sort of in the middle. Actually, that is a bit misleading, though, because DR Congo has tremendous mineral wealth that I believe artificially inflates its position. If you look at a lot of measurements of development, it rates quite low indeed. A big question is there are many questions, but one is whether or not the persistently high rates of fertility in sub-Saharan Africa are associated with inadequate availability of contraception. And I'll show you a few maps that would indicate this is true, at least for some countries. This is a very curious map looking at what is called sometimes the fertility gap, which is the gap between the size of families that people want and the number of children they end up having. So countries here in shades of red are undershooting ideals. In other words, you can see Poland there, and actually several countries in Eastern Europe that are dark red, meaning that people, according to surveys, want to have more children than they actually have. Generally, they're not able to have the children that they desire because of economic difficulties. interesting, there are a couple of countries in that red shade in Africa, Niger and Chad, both of which have very high rates of fertility, which is really rather extraordinary that people would want even larger families, because that's quite unusual. And then fertility exceeds ideals are in blue, mostly located in tropical Africa, at least the countries in darker shades of blue. Bolivia in South America is in that category, which is interesting. But in general, that blue category, especially darker blue, is in Africa. And that would seemingly indicate that problems with finding ways to limit fertility to what people actually want to have. And that's often because of the lack of availability of contraception. Another map looks at use of modern birth control, and you can see these colors in the shade of red have low percentage of use of modern birth control. And again, we see a real concentration in tropical Africa. Not entirely. There are some countries outside of Africa where there's low rates of modern contraception, but also low rates of fertility. Bosnia, for example, Northern Macedonia, and Azerbaijan would be in that category. But there are non-modern means of birth control that would be quite effective. And also, we really have to have some skepticism about how accurate the data are. Those who look at this issue show that there's a pretty close correlation of contraceptive use and reduced fertility, which is not at all surprising. So this scatter plot is out of date, 2010, but we can see a very clear line of the percentage of the population using contraception and the total fertility rate. And again, if we just focus in on Africa and look at modern birth control use, we can see it's very low in the dark red countries, and then all of which have high rates of fertility. And we can also look at the demand for family planning and ask whether it's satisfied by modern methods, or at least according to one survey. And the countries in light shades that is not satisfied. Notice that DR Congo is definitely in that category. As the southern part of Africa, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia in particular and Zimbabwe on this map have relatively high rates of family planning being satisfied by modern methods, as does Kenya. This is something that governments can do a lot with by establishing clinics and subsidizing contraceptions or making them widely available. Countries with effective governments, many of them are concentrated in the southern part of Africa. Kenya would probably be in that category. Rwanda would. Rwanda is a small country just to the east, slightly north of the O and DR Congo. You could see a dark color there, but it has quite effective government and quite good ability to satisfy desire for contraception use. On the map, on both maps, Nigeria has been highlighted. It's sort of in the middle on both of these categories. But I want to focus in on Nigeria because it is sub-Saharan Africa's demographic giant with twice the population or more than the next most populous country, which would be Ethiopia. And look at this graph of projection of Nigeria's population up to the year 2100. And again, of course, these projections always have to be taken with a healthy degree of skepticism. But it has Nigeria as just way outpopulating any other African country, although DR Congo has on this graph zooming ahead a little bit after 2050. Ethiopia has been much more successful in creating a modern society with an effective government and economic and social development than has Democratic Republic of Congo, and therefore it's projected, and I would agree with this, that DR Congo's population will exceed that of Ethiopia before too long. But Nigeria is the one that is really notable here. You could see in 1950, where the graph begins, it had a larger population than these other African countries, but not by that much. But at present and projected into the future, its population is going to really surge ahead. Another interesting way to look at it is to compare it with two other countries that had roughly equal populations in 1950, Bangladesh and Pakistan. Actually, Bangladesh and Pakistan were one country at that time. They were later to divide in the 1970s. But all three of those countries had populations of around 38 million at the time. And you can see these very different trajectories. Bangladesh has been the most successful country of these three in reducing its fertility. It's had very effective government plan campaigns and projects to make contraceptive use available to the public, and the public has responded. Pakistan has been much more reluctant to do this sort of family planning strategies and techniques. Certainly not without them, but as birth control is much more limited than it is in Bangladesh, and Pakistan's population has really surged ahead already. You can see a pretty big gap in 2020, and that is going to increase. So Nigeria is a country that I think there are many reasons to be concerned about, not just because of its fertility, but also because of problems of a potentially failed state and many, many conflicts. And Pakistan might be put in the same category. It's quite densely populated, particularly its effective population density is very high because Pakistan has many areas that are very arid and mountainous and really not suitable to large-scale human habitation. And it has a tremendous number of environmental problems, water availability, salinization, and a lot of ethnic tension and conflict, and a very rapidly growing population, which puts it in, many people think, pretty perilous situation. Nigeria is going to surpass the United States to become the world's third most populous country after India and China. I'm not sure when that will happen, but it's almost certain to happen. Well, I shouldn't say that because nothing is certain, but the chances are quite high. This graph is putting that period of Nigeria surpassing the United States being in green and Nigeria in red here, sometime around 2040. I wouldn't at all be surprised. In terms of things like a literacy rate, Nigeria is sort of in the middle for Africa, not as low as countries to its north, the Sahel countries like Niger, just north of Nigeria, or Mali or Chad or Central African Republic, but not nearly as high a level as what you would find in South Africa or Namibia. Oil-rich, very small country called Equatorial Guinea, a little bit to the south and east of Nigeria, is also high in literacy, and that's just a reflection of its oil wealth and small population. Generally has not generally done a good job in social development, but it's done better in literacy. It might be surprising that Nigeria has such relatively low levels of social development, considering the fact that it also has tremendous oil reserves and a thriving oil industry, although a troubled oil industry. One of the issues, though, is Nigeria also has this very large population, and it's also well known for its political corruption. Of course, all countries have some degree of corruption, but it does vary from country to country. And Nigeria, partly because of its oil wealth, when a country has huge reserves of a natural resource like oil, it sometimes can make corruption a more difficult problem. So Nigeria has not done as well in terms of social development as one might expect given its economic importance. It is really a very important economic hub in Africa. It has the largest film industry, and some would say parts of Nigeria have a lot of economic dynamism, but the country as a whole has some big problems. So I want to explore some of those problems. One is it has very marked religious and ethnic tensions, and political tensions, we could say as well. The map on the left shows the percentage of the Muslim population, and you can see the far north is overwhelmingly Muslim. The southwest part of the country is divided between Muslim and Christian populations. The southeastern part of the country is very low percentage of Muslims and very high percentage of Christians. So we have several splits in Nigeria, pitting the southeast, which is Christian, with the north, which is mostly Muslim, and then other zones that are mixed. This division is reflected in almost every Nigerian presidential election. The country has an informal deal where the presidency alternates between a Muslim candidate and a Christian candidate. Since the country as a whole is pretty evenly divided between the two faiths, with a few more Muslims than Christians, that kind of power sharing has worked relatively well. At least it's kept the country functioning. But if you look at actual electoral returns, we can see a country that really doesn't have a very strong sense of common political ideas. A lot of countries are like that. The United States is quite strongly polarized regionally in terms of politics. But in the United States, if you take the most Republican state, Wyoming, often in that category, and compare it to the most Democratic voting state, perhaps Hawaii or Massachusetts, there are several that contend for that position. There's a big gap, but it's you get a gap that's more like 70%, 30%. Whereas in Nigeria, we have states where it's 90 and 10%. You could see all the states in the southeastern part of the country, the mostly Christian part of the country. In the election in 2011, over 90% voted for Goodluck Jonathan, Christian candidate. In some districts, he got 95, 98%. Whereas in the north, there are several states over 90% by Muhammadu Buhari, who was the Muslim candidate. And again, in some districts, well over 95%. So when you look at electoral returns like that, it indicates a country that has a pretty low level of political integration, maybe might be the way to put it. This religious divide is also correlates with economic and fertility divides. Let's start by looking at the map on the right. That's per capita GDP by state. It's a map I made. It's quite out of date, 2007. It'd be interesting to update it. I don't think the patterns have changed that much. And with a country like Nigeria, it's also difficult to get reliable information, and a lot of uncertainty about this information. But you could see levels of per capita GDP, and that's the total goods and services produced in a given region in terms of its population. You could see the southeast, not all of the southeast, but most of the southeast has much higher rates of economic development, as does the southwest, which is mixed in terms of its religious background. And then in the north, especially in the far north, much lower levels of economic development. Partly it's a question of where the resources are. The oil wealth is in the south and mostly in the southeast and south central part of the country. But it also reflects differences in education. That's the southeastern part of the country where the Igbo ethnic group is the dominant ethnic group, and most of the population is Christian. It's long had higher levels of education, which is associated with somewhat higher rates of economic development as well, although it certainly has its trouble. You do see one blue state right in the middle of the country. That's the Federal Capital Territory. The capital was moved out of Lagos in the south west to Abuja in the central region. And it also shows all the states in the far north have Sharia law or the use of Islamic law in their legal systems. Population density is interesting. It's quite concentrated both in the north and in the south, particularly the north central part. That's where the Hausa ethnic group is dominant. You can see the state of Kano with very high population density. And then in the mostly Christian southeast, as well as in the mixed southwest. The southwest is dominated by the Yoruba people. They have a strong sense of ethnic identity, but it's mixed between Muslims, Christians, and people who follow the indigenous Yoruba faith. The map on the right shows the middle belt, and you can see on the population density map that this is the lower density part of the country. Until recently, some parts of the middle belt were quite sparsely populated. That sparse population has attracted a lot of migrants, both from the north and from the south. And as migrants stream into this region, tensions have exacerbated. So the middle belt is a particularly troubled part of Nigeria. Here's a graph from armed conflict location and event data. showing a little bit out of date, but from 2005 to mid 2021, the farmer-herder conflict in the Central Belt, particularly the eastern part of the Central Belt. So what is happening here is that there are many people in northern Nigeria and in central Nigeria who are traditional herders who follow their large herds of cattle around as they graze. Particular people of the Fulani ethnic group. Historically, they've been a very militarily powerful group. Pastoralists or herders often have more military power, but economically they're less integrated into the modern economic system, if you will. But these conflicts between herders and pastoralists have been intensifying, resulting in a lot of loss of life. And these conflicts are happening continually. If you go back in time or to areas with sparse population, farmers and herders often get along quite well, and they actually have certain complementarities. For example, after farmers harvest their crops, it can be useful to have herders move their animals in to graze the stubble and drop their manure in the soil, and that can actually help maintain fertility. But when population increases, pressures on resources increase as well, and you can break down this mutualistic relationship, and you can have herders then moving their animals into farmers' fields before they've ripened and causing all sorts of problems. In the Central Belt, herders are generally Muslim, farmers are often Christian. These conflicts have led to a lot of Christian-Muslim conflicts, and tensions, and outright violence. And this is actually found through much of the country. So, for example, a couple very recent articles here from 2025 of Nigerian bishop says attacks on Christians increasing in Africa's most populous country. And the one on the bottom is very interesting. Massacre of Christians putting Biafrans out of Nigeria. So Biafra refers to a state established by the Igbo people in the southeastern part of the country, Christian population, who actually declared themselves independent of Nigeria in the 1960s and were essentially starved into submission. I don't think herders are moving into Igbo land proper, but Igbos have spread into other areas, and they are having these sorts of conflicts. And then a map here just showing general issues of conflict in Nigeria, and you can just see how extensive they are. For example, in the far northeast, there's the Boko Haram group. This is a radical Islamist group. Officially, what Boko Haram means is a book, or standing in for Western education. Western education is prohibited, and Boko Haram has been responsible for a lot of attacks on schools, and you can see here attacks on military positions, kidnappings, massacres, and so on. In the northwestern part of the country, the map is showing bandits who engage in mass kidnapping for ransom, looting, livestock theft. In the middle belt, we see this huge zone of conflict over access to agricultural land. In the Igbo heartland in the southeast of the country, there's the indigenous people of Biafra. Many of the Igbo are still wanting independence. If the entire southeast of Nigeria were to be an independent country, it would have much higher rates of economic and social development. As I mentioned before, that's where most of the resources are, although the most important city is Lagos in the south western part of the country, traditionally Yoruba land. And then in the Delta region, that's the south central part, delta of the Niger River, cultists and militants, organized criminal gangs. A lot of these are criminal gangs seeking access to oil pipelines. They'll often take oil out of the pipe, just sell it in barrels. Huge amount of environmental devastation associated with that, or attacks for ransom on offshore oil installations. All of these sorts of actions are really harming Nigeria in so many different ways and preventing it from developing to its potential. Nigeria does have a lot of human capital. There are a lot of highly educated people in the country, and have been some very successful businesses, but the country is not succeeding very well, and many think it is at the risk of becoming a failed state. And if that were to happen, and you look at its rapidly growing population, it's difficult not to be concerned. Well, let's switch our topic to Latin America, a region of relatively low and declining fertility levels. Now, these figures are ostensibly from 2024, and they're from the UN Population Fund, but they're way too high in many countries. And I'll give you some other information to show what they probably are. If we were to take this map on face value, it shows just a few countries with fertility rates higher than the replacement level, which is 2.1 or so, 2.2 if you have a high child mortality. But we have in Central South America, Paraguay at 2.4, Bolivia with 2.5. In the far north, there's Guyana. I didn't put the number in. Interesting, French Guiana, which is that the darkest reddish area, that's actually part of France. It's not a colony. It's an integral part of France. It has by far the highest fertility rate of France. In the Caribbean, we have Haiti at 2.7, and in Central America, Guatemala at 2.3. Honduras is also shown as above replacement level. But all those countries are slipping down to replacement level or below. Well, perhaps not Haiti, but the others are. And we have gray countries here like Venezuela and Ecuador, Peru essentially at replacement level, Nicaragua essentially at replacement level as well, Dominican Republic in that same category, and then a lot of countries well below. And for both Central America and South America as a whole, according to this data, the fertility rate is around 1.8, which is not particularly low, not super low, but definitely well below the replacement level. And then individual countries in this category. Well, let's focus on Chile with 1.5, almost certainly way too high. And I'll get into the details in a second. From 60 to 2010, virtually all of Latin America had this quite rapid drop in fertility. You could see Nicaragua was well over 7, and Brazil over 6, and you could see them dropping down. Brazil in the red line is easy to follow from over 6 to below 2 already by 2010. Argentina is an interesting, a bit of an outlier, because you could see in 1960 it had by far the lowest fertility rate, just a little over 3, similar to what was found in much of Western Europe and the United States in the so-called baby boom period. Argentina is a country that has sort of much closer cultural connections to Europe than other Latin American countries. Its population is very heavily of Italian background, also a large Spanish background as well, but Italians are actually the largest group. The Argentines have long sort of styled themselves as something of a European outpost in Latin America. If you go back far enough, Argentina was a very prosperous country. Back in, say, 1900, it had one of the higher rates of GDP per capita, mostly by virtue of a pretty low population density and ability to export huge amounts of agricultural goods to Europe and other highly developed countries. But Argentina's has had a lot of experience of economic stagnation, depending on how you look at it. But its fertility actually increased in the 1980s and then dropped again. And it's well below replacement level, but it now is actually higher than a lot of its neighbors. If you go back here, the UN is showing it as 1.9, much higher than other neighboring or nearby countries like Brazil or Uruguay or Chile. I mentioned in class, I think it wasn't in a lecture, it was in discussion after the class, but there has been some articles linking the rapid decline of fertility in Brazil with the spread of cable television, which brings into view telenovelas or soap operas, as they would often be called in the United States. And there have been studies showing very similar things happening in India. Brazil probably has the best study of this from 2008, so it's been around a while. But this is a very detailed study, and they could chart the timing of the entry of Globo, a television company, where it simply wasn't available, and then it comes in, and almost immediately in those areas fertility starts to drop. And the general thesis here is that it drops because these telenovelas are portraying families with just 2 children or very small families, and they're portrayed as prosperous and leading a desirable lifestyle that people want to emulate. I think studies have even shown different patterns of naming where more children are named after characters in these telenovelas, so they're extremely important. So just to show you the text I highlighted, we find that controlling for time-varying controls and for time-invariant area characteristics, the presence of the Globo signal leads to significantly lower fertility. This is a way can be considered part and parcel of the modernization project, which has many different cultural registers, but it's associated with more modern lifestyles, access to technology, mobility, improved communications, all of which have correlated in many parts of the world with decreased fertility rates. Latin America has relatively low rates of immigration. It's a region that still sends out immigrants rather than gets a lot of immigrants from abroad. And that's quite different from North America. And by North America here, we just simply mean the United States and Canada. So Mexico is, and Central America, are part of North America by continental standards, but in cultural terms, they are not. So this graph, again, from the United Nations World Population Projects, a bit out of date, shows the population of North America is eventually surpassing that of South America, of the U.S. and Canada. And the reason would be that the U.S. and Canada are projected to still have high rates of immigration from abroad. And almost certainly they will have probably they will have higher rates. And so I don't think this is out of line. But it's showing all parts of Latin America, South America, Central America, Caribbean as declining in population as fertility declines and little immigration makes up for it. The next part of the lecture, I want to focus on the country of Chile, which has had this very rapid fertility decline. You could see in 1950 it was close to 5, and it remained that way till 1960 or so, and then started to drop and sort of plateaued in the 80s, dropped again, plateaued again, and then dropped again. According to database Earth, its total fertility rate is now 1.13. Now, if you remember, the UN had said it was 1.5. I think this is a more accurate depiction. And 1.13 is extremely low, but it's in line of what one finds in much of Southern Europe, even Eastern Europe, and much of East Asia, with the exception of South Korea, where it is significantly lower. But there are demographers who are saying that in the last couple of years, Chile has just seen a spectacular collapse of fertility rate. So there's More Births account on Twitter or X. It's obviously a pro-natalist site. The name would give it away. And they may be exaggerating this decline. But on the other hand, they claim they're just looking at the birth data that's coming out of Chile, and they can calculate it. And what they are saying is that in 2024, Chile recorded a fertility rate of just 0.88 births per woman, a drop of 23% in a year and 51% since 2015. No other country has seen fertility fall as fast. And the site goes on to say that social changes have overwhelmed Chile and threatened its future. Now, I was very frustrated in not finding many articles about this very rapid decline, just posts on social media. Now, academic articles are not going to be around because they take too long to come out. The research and the publication process is long standing, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. I have been known to make jokes that entire industries rise and fall while academics wait for their books and articles to be reviewed. But one would perhaps expect more from journalists, and I didn't find much. I did find this France 24 article, which has been widely cited by others, about Chile's birth rate plummeting as women say no to motherhood. But the question is, why has it dropped so rapidly, so quickly? And I'm not finding much information. And in fact, this article has some very misleading information. It says Chilean women have gained greater access to education, especially since universities became free in 2008 and entered the workforce in higher numbers. That didn't happen. It did happen to some degree in 2016. Higher education did become free for those, I believe it was below 50% of the national income level. I'm not exactly sure. But higher education has been greatly expanded, and that's happened relatively recently, within the last decade or so. And that then can well be associated with this drop because more women, especially women from poorer families, receive higher education. They're going to be acquiring new views, new outlooks on the world, more sort of more modern, and are going to be wanting better career opportunities for themselves. And so young women who had, say, been entering college in 2016 would now be sort of coming into their peak periods of fertility, and many of them are indeed saying no to motherhood. Trying to find out a sort of explanation for this, I thought, well, what happens if I turn to chat bots? So I looked at Chat GPT, and I looked at Grok 3, that's the one associated with X, just to see how they looked at it. Well, one is they had different numbers. It's interesting, Chat GPT using the figure, essentially that was found on database Earth 1.7, Grok having the lower figure of 0.88. But mostly they give explanations that are not unique to Chile. I mean, we could look at this answer from Grok. Chile's fertility rate has plummeted due to the confluence of economic insecurity, empowered women delaying or foregoing motherhood, widespread contraception use, shifting cultural values, lack of robust policy support for families. This decline, while reflective of global standards, has been uniquely swift in Chile. Yeah, all of that's true, but the reasons offered are not unique to Chile. So I think we really have to do better. I wouldn't expect a chatbot necessarily to have those answers. One thing that I've been thinking about, and this is just speculative, but I think it may have some connection with the fact that Chile had a very sort of right-wing authoritarian government from 1973 to 1990. That government did enact economic reforms that led to much more rapid economic growth, and eventually, especially after Chile became democratic in 1990, were able to translate that economic growth into improved social development. So you have a country where you have had this long period of authoritarian rule, and that sort of authoritarian rule often ends up radicalizing many people, particularly younger people, who do not want to be under this sort of authoritarian government. And then when you have a change of government, you often get a sharp turn to the left. That certainly happened to Spain. It was under the right-wing authoritarian rule of Francisco Franco from the late 1930s to 1975. And then after Franco died, Spain had very rapid sort of liberalization and sort of wholesale cultural change. And it's perhaps not coincidental that Spain now has one of the lower fertility rates of the world. And it's also important to note that Chile has had these lot of protest movements, youth protests in particular. And this is well after the military regime ended and Chile democratized. But you have this situation that's common in the world where unrest, social sort of civic unrest, often comes about in environments where you have improving economic and social conditions, but widespread feelings that they are not improving fast enough. You have more and more people with higher rates of education and desire for improvement, which isn't happening. So Chile had these huge student protests and really brought the country to its knees in 2011, 2013. And it did result in an end to a school voucher system and its replacement by a public education system managed by the state, end of for-profit education. So that strike achieved a lot of its aims, but it also led to education system becoming more liberal or left-wing, depending on how one wants to look at it. And that has repercussions for young people's sort of ideological stances. Perhaps equally important is the fact that although Chile has had this rapid economic and social development, it still has some very deeply ingrained inequalities. So one thing the government has done is to focus on people at the lowest level of wealth, which is understandable, and therefore sort of extreme poverty rate has really dropped, making it, as I've highlighted here in the text, an economic miracle. But as the text also goes on to say, this economic growth covered up the growing inequality of Chile. So Chile still has high levels of inequality no matter how you look at it. So there may be sort of a tensions resulting in these sorts of changes. And this article from the Borgen Project also notes that there's a lot of gender inequality in Chile. So it had a sort of a more traditional gender relations, and as women's education rates have increased, there's been a sort of stickiness in gender relations, and they haven't quite caught up to what has happened. So women in Chile are now experiencing gender-based violence with severe income disparities, or at least that's what the article is claiming. And then the article goes on to say legislation exists that prohibits sexual harassment in the workplace, but there are no criminal implications for perpetrators and no remedies for victims. And the legal system does not require equal pay for equal work, does not forbid gender discrimination in credit access. And another challenge Chilean women faces that the default marital property regime automatically makes the husband the head of the household, giving him control of marital property. It's not only Chile, but other countries have been put in the same sort of category. Let's say South Korea, where they've had this very rapid economic and social development, but cultural conditions haven't changed as much, which means in terms of fertility and gender relations go, it's widely stated that South Korean men still expect their wives to do almost all the house care and child work, but most of those wives now have their own careers, so that leads then to gender tensions and very low birth rates. So something similar may be happening in Chile, and that would differentiate it to some degree with other countries in Latin America. That it has had this more rapid increase in social and economic development, but then more rapid than other countries in the region. So that these may be some of the factors, and I'm not trying to offer explanations. I don't think we can really give a complete explanation to something like this, but this very rapid drop in fertility in Chile is important. It has real sort of dire implications for the country, because if you look at, if it goes the way of South Korea and it ends up with these very, very small numbers of children, it will be very difficult down the road for that small cohort of children as they age to support the very, very large cohorts of retired people, people who need much more health care in the future. While teaching this class, I've often been asked what my own view is on the fertility issue, and I try to keep my own view to the background. But as we are at the end of the class, I suppose I might as well be honest about this. I do think that many parts of the world, and the world as a whole, can probably be regarded as overpopulated by people. Humans consume a disproportionate share of the resources of the planet, leaving pretty small share for other species. And so I don't think population decline is something to be feared, but I do think really rapid population decline is to be feared, because that can just result in wholesale social collapse. And I think that's quite likely to happen in a country like South Korea or Chile. Ideal fertility rates, if you follow my line of thinking, might be on the order of 1.8 children per woman, which would mean then eventually a population decline, but in a very manageable system. Looking at countries with these just collapses in fertility, I have a hard time seeing how they're going to maintain social cohesion. In the last couple of slides here, I want to just stay on Chile first, but to look at how people in Chile are tackling this low fertility rate, those who are concerned about it. It's an interesting organization called the International Federation of Fertility Societies, but it's mostly just on things like treating fertility problems where women would want to conceive and can't, or by lobbying, or by having educational campaigns. These don't seem to be very effective. In China, there's an opposite tack being taken. I don't know how successful this will be either. There's a very recent article from the New York Times, or one Chinese company in particular told single workers get married or get out. But you can see at the bottom of the text I've highlighted, if you cannot get married and start a family within 3 quarters, the company will terminate your labor contract. Now, this is just one company, but it is possible that this will become more widespread in China, and it is possible that the government will enact similar policies. I don't necessarily think it's likely, but China is quite an authoritarian state, and the government is becoming increasingly concerned about its very low fertility rate, which may be lower than official statistics put it. And China is certainly capable of having this sort of authoritarian response. And if one's job is threatened, and if one is threatened with privation from not having children, well, then that maybe would have more effectiveness, but also would be extremely socially disruptive. And my final slide, I just want to make a little bit of a speculation. First, I have to mention that historians often talk about long centuries, the sort of a period of roughly a century that doesn't quite fit the actual numbers given them. So, for example, historians will talk about the long 19th century. Some would begin with the French Revolution in the late 1700s and then ended at the end of World War I. So a century that's longer than a century. But by the same token, scholars are now talking about the long 20th century, which would essentially begin after the end of World War I, but it's perhaps coming to an end right now, because as is quite obvious, we are in a period of tremendous upheaval and change. It looks like the Atlantic Alliance, which was the most important geopolitical structuring device from the end of World War II up into the 21st century, seems to be unraveling. We seem to be entering an era of increased nationalism. We don't know if that's really going to happen. I do not think the future is predictable. Unanticipated events are always going to come up. and things that can change everything. But we do seem to be in a period of particular instability right now. And that period seems to be connected with these very low fertility rates in many parts of the world. So periods of instability usually don't last. They change into some sort of new semi-stable situation. And that may come about with changing fertility rates. So that's really not much to say. But it is difficult to make any sorts of final pronouncements on that. So at any rate, I hope you have enjoyed these lectures, and this concludes the GeoCurrent series on global demographic patterns. Thank you for listening.